Today's story takes place on Halloween 2011 in the small town of Armstrong, British Columbia. Located in the Spalumcheen Valley, about 480 kilometers away from Vancouver, Armstrong was established in 1892 as a result of the Okanagan Railway construction. The region would eventually become known for dairy farming, leading to the establishment of Armstrong cheese in the early 1900s. According to the latest census taken in 2021, Armstrong has a population of 5,323 people. It's known as a safe place, one of those towns where nothing bad ever happens. Until it does. Living in Armstrong at the time was 18-year-old Taylor Van Diest. She lived there with her parents and her twin sister named Kirsty. Taylor had just graduated from Pleasant Valley Secondary School, and she was known as someone who was really sweet and a good friend to everybody. She loved music and in high school participated in jazz, blues, junior, and senior band. And in her spare time, she enjoyed watching horror movies and RuPaul's Drag Race. And on her Facebook page, she wrote that she was looking forward to getting her driver's license and a job, and also posted about plans to get her first tattoo, which would be a bass treble heart in her right inner wrist, expressing her love of music. According to her mother, Mary Van Diest, Taylor was an awesome girl, and anyone who first met her instantly fell for her. Halloween was Taylor's favorite time of the year, and on October 31st, 2011, she planned to meet up with a group of friends to go out trick-or-treating. Taylor decided to dress up as a zombie that night and would make her own costume. She left her home at 5:45 p.m. and walked north on Pleasant Valley Road for about 10 minutes. She then proceeded through a shortcut, which was a well-traveled route away from the road, alongside the railroad tracks. As she walked, she would continue texting and send a total of 10 text messages to friends, and received 7 back. The last contact Taylor would have with her friends or family was at 6:02 p.m., when she sent a text message to her boyfriend. The short message read, quote, "being crept." It was a misspelled text message. I'm going to assume she was trying to type out being creeped. She would then try to send out another text message 38 seconds later. A single word Holly was typed and was saved into the draft folder of her phone. At this very same time, a woman named Delphine, who lived nearby, was outside checking on her pumpkins in front of her house. She would hear 2 screams that sounded like they were coming from the path by the railroad tracks, and described the first scream as sounding more distraught than the second one. Delphine's friend Natasha was visiting her home at the time and also heard one of the screams, but because it was Halloween and the sound of screams are typically normal for that night, neither gave it a second thought. Friends would become worried when Taylor failed to respond to multiple messages. This was completely unlike her. Like most young people, she was always on her phone. And when she didn't show up that night to meet her friends, they instantly knew that something was wrong. The group would drive around Armstrong for about an hour and a half searching, but found no trace of her. At about 8 p.m., a separate group of teenagers were walking along the railroad tracks and would discover Taylor's phone. Wanting to return the phone to its owner, one of the teenagers immediately called the home number and told the Van Diest family where he found Taylor's phone, on the path near the railroad tracks. By now, Taylor's family knew she had failed to arrive at her friend's house that evening, and once they learned where her phone had been located, they would contact the RCMP and report Taylor as missing. However, friends and family did not want to sit around and wait, and would go down to the tracks to search for Taylor themselves. It wouldn't be long before she was found. Less than 1 hour later, Taylor would be located by friends, family, and the RCMP. She was found unconscious in the bushes approximately 10 feet from the railroad tracks that ran through Armstrong. The first officer on the scene was Constable Milan Illich, who initially thought he was just looking for a missing teenage girl wearing a zombie costume. He couldn't have known this would soon morph into a homicide investigation. Taylor was found sprawled out on her stomach, with the left side of her head leaning against a large steel pipe. She was still alive, although she was struggling to breathe. She had a faint pulse, but Constable Illich could not see any noticeable injuries at first. The makeup she was wearing for her zombie costume and the darkness of the area made it somewhat difficult to see her wounds, and the way she was lying on the ground also concealed some of her injuries. However, it was evident that Taylor was gravely injured. When paramedics arrived on the scene, they would roll Taylor over, only to discover a large gash on the side of her head, as well as 3 ligature marks on her neck. It was their opinion there was a good possibility she had a fractured skull as well. Paramedics also noticed other possible bruising on Taylor's arms and chin. However, these marks were difficult to assess at first because of her Halloween makeup. Taylor would be rushed by ambulance to Vernon Jubilee Hospital, where she was immediately examined by registered nurse Diane Romer, who specialized in sexual assault cases. Diane would take clippings of nails on both of Taylor's hands, in hopes of finding DNA evidence that would ID her attacker. She was also examined by Dr. Michael Concannon that evening. Dr. Concannon quickly noticed the ligature marks around her neck, but also had the same problem the paramedics had. Taylor's costume makeup made determining the extent of her injuries challenging, but he was able to conclude she had additional trauma to her face and head, and had what looked to be a bite mark on her lip. While at the hospital, Taylor was hooked up to a ventilator, but her injuries would be too severe. She would go into cardiac arrest before eventually succumbing to her injuries and passing away the next morning. News of Taylor's murder would devastate the small town of Armstrong. This is not a community known for violent crime, let alone murder. But from the beginning, the police investigation would move quickly, with more than 30 officers working the case. They tried to determine Taylor's movements between the times of 5:50 p.m. and 8:45 p.m. Halloween night, and a forensic investigation team, as well as 24 officers using police dogs, combed through the brush on both sides of the train tracks near where Taylor was found, searching for clues. Police were also asking residents of Armstrong to report any strange activity they may have seen or heard in the area, and they also wanted to speak with anyone who may have received text messages or photos from the victim. But 24 hours into the investigation, police would admit to the media they had no suspects or persons of interest connected to Taylor's murder, and they were advising the public to be vigilant until her killer was caught.
It sounds from these warnings you're giving that there's nothing to say that this crime couldn't have been completely random.
We don't have a suspect at this time, as I said earlier, so we are just reminding the public to be cautious, as they should on any given day. Sometimes what happens when we live in a small community, we don't always remember some of our safety precautions because we figure, well, it won't happen here. It's a small community, we know everyone. So even though you're in a small community, we need to let everybody just be aware and be aware of your surroundings at all times.
So you don't know then if it was random or targeted?
At this point, we do not, no.
Corey, let's talk about this message on October 31st. What are you getting at there?
What we're getting at is we believe that there were messages sent back and forth between her and friends. There may be some information within that message that will be useful in our investigation. We want everyone out there that may have some information or a timeline. We're trying to figure out all of her movements up until 8:45 when she was found. So we can put a timeline together of her movements there that may go a long ways in assisting us in solving this particular crime.
Are you talking text message, Facebook?
All communication. Could be a phone call, could be a text message, could be a photograph that was sent back and forth as she was getting ready to go out. No piece of information is too small. Sometimes people think, well, it may not be important. We're asking, please provide that information to us, let us decide.
Because of the randomness of the attack and the lack of suspects, the entire town of Armstrong was anxious, to say the least. There were also rumors circulating that Taylor could possibly have a stalker, and while being interviewed, RCMP spokesperson Gord Melindick let it slip that Taylor might have been followed into the area where she was attacked. Or she could have been meeting someone, or the suspects might have already been waiting there. Police really didn't know at this point. A roadblock checkpoint along the same route that Taylor Van Diest walked before she was attacked was set up by police, and drivers were interviewed and shown photos of Taylor in her Halloween costume in hopes of jogging someone's memory. Those same photos would be released to the media 3 days after Taylor was killed. All police knew at this point was that Taylor had left her home and walked north on Pleasant Valley Road for about 8 blocks before she was attacked and found severely injured along the railroad tracks running through Armstrong. That same day, a forensic autopsy would be completed, but the RCMP were not releasing the details. They would only say in a press briefing that the results of the autopsy were considered holdback evidence in their investigation. In other words, information that was only known to the killer. Quote, "Right now, the only people who know the full details of this death are the pathologist, a few investigators, and the person or persons responsible for the crime." But then, on Wednesday, November 9th, the Armstrong RCMP detachment announced that they had received a disturbing letter from someone who claimed to be the person responsible for Taylor's murder. This letter also threatened more harm against the women of British Columbia. Police wouldn't give any details regarding the contents of the letter, including how it was sent, if it was typed or handwritten, or whether any fingerprints or other evidence had been obtained from it. They would only say they were investigating the letter's authenticity, and that the letter contained only very limited details about the crime. Police would hold a press conference that day, and RCMP Constable Dan Moskalok would say that police wanted the letter writer to contact them to create a dialogue and to prevent future violence in the community. In the meantime, the RCMP cautioned the public to remain vigilant and continue to take extra personal safety precautions. Residents were encouraged to travel in groups, walk in areas with good visibility, and to make sure that if they did go out alone, someone always knew where they were going. Meanwhile, the mayor of Armstrong would tell the media that the town was feeling uneasy, operating at a heightened level of caution, and that the murder of one of their own had turned the entire community upside down. About 10 days after police received that threatening letter, they would announce there had been no further contact with the writer, and they were still unable to confirm if this person was actually responsible for Taylor's murder. And then on November 22nd, the North Okanagan RCMP would hold another press conference and announce there was a significant development into the murder of Taylor Van Diest. Male DNA that was found on her body was matched to another cold case. This unidentified suspect was wanted for a sexual assault that occurred in Kelowna on April 12, 2005, inside the Garden of Eden Escort Agency on Lawrence Avenue. And although his DNA was not in the known offender DNA database, police did have a composite drawing of their suspect from the 2005 assault. The man was described as being Caucasian, 19 to 20 years old at the time of the offense, with darker skin tone, brown eyes, and short dark hair, which would make him about 25 to 26 years old now. He stood about 5'8 to 5'10 in height, had a stocky build, but was not particularly fit or muscular. He also had large, distinct sideburns and thick eyebrows. Although police cautioned his appearance could have changed over the past 6 years. Police believed that their suspect was a resident of the Okanagan Valley, both in 2005 and 6 years later, and that his friends, family, and associates held valuable information which would help solve both of these crimes. Corporal Dan Muskaluk would state that their suspect was believed to have some form of conflict or personal upset in the days leading up to Taylor's murder, and that there also may have been noticeable changes to the suspect's routine, including missed appointments for school, work, or personal commitments. The suspect may have been facing financial pressures, relationship pressures, job losses, or other serious life stressors that may have manifested themselves visibly. And he may also have unexplained scratches to his face, neck, or arms as a result of contact with Taylor Van Diest. By now, it was 3 weeks into the investigation, and about 500 tips had been submitted to police, and an additional 150 tips were received after the sketch of the suspect was re-released. But it would take another 5 months before police had their suspect behind bars.
Shortly before 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, or 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, on Wednesday, April 4th, investigators from the Southeast District Major Crime Unit, on the strength of a Canada-wide warrant, arrested Matthew Stephen Foerster at a motel in Collingwood, Ontario. 58-year-old Stephen Roy Foerster, a current resident of Cherryville, British Columbia, has been charged with obstruction of justice and accessory after the fact to murder in connection with the homicide death of Taylor Van Diest. Around 2:20 p.m. British Columbia time on Wednesday, April 4th, investigators from the Southeast District Major Crime Unit, assisted by the Lumbee, North Okanagan, Vernon Detachment, arrested Stephen Roy Foerster at his residence in Cherryville, British Columbia. Both remain in custody at this time.
On April 11, 2012, Brendan Fitzpatrick, who was the operations officer for the BC RCMP Major Crimes Unit, announced that 2 suspects had been arrested in connection with Taylor's murder. Under arrest was 26-year-old Matthew Foerster, who was a former resident of Cherryville, British Columbia. He didn't have a criminal record, and there was nothing to indicate that Taylor and Matthew knew each other. Police would charge him with second-degree murder, as well as 1 count of sexual assault and unlawful confinement in connection with the 2005 case. He was also facing additional charges in connection to a separate home invasion that took place on October 19, 2004, where a 19-year-old woman was assaulted by a man wearing a mask in Cherryville, BC. Strangely enough, Matthew's father, 58-year-old Stephen Foerster, would be charged with obstruction of justice and accessory after the fact. But police wouldn't say what Stephen did to obstruct their investigation or what role he might have played in Taylor's murder. Suspicions began to fall on Matthew Foerster once police released the composite sketch of their suspect. RCMP Inspector Brendan Fitzpatrick would say that police received a total of 1,250 tips from the public after releasing the sketch. Some of the tips submitted came directly from the Foersters' friends and family. Cherryville is a teeny-tiny community in British Columbia. Presently, the population is somewhere between 900 and 1,000 people, but back in 2011, it was only around 600. And someone who looked like Matthew Foerster kind of stood out. As rumors began to circulate throughout Cherryville, the RCMP made several attempts to talk with the Foerster family, and also spoke with Matthew's landlord and previous employers. And at one point, 2 longtime friends of Stephen Foerster called him up to ask him about the sketch. Stephen is said to have responded with, quote, "If he's guilty, he's guilty. If he's not, then he's not." Matthew would eventually be discovered over 3,000 kilometers away from Armstrong. He was hiding out in a hotel in Collingwood, Ontario. News of the arrest brought some relief to the small town of Armstrong, with the mayor of the town telling the media that Taylor's murder had changed the community forever. Taylor's mother, Mary Van Diest, told reporters that the family had been waiting for this news for 5 months, and that this day was filled with mixed emotions as they finally had a suspect to direct their anger towards. Shortly after Matthew Foerster was arrested, the North Okanagan RCMP released a video showing what he looked like currently and compared to his older photos. They hoped more people would come forward with tips about his movements between the night of Halloween and his arrest 5 months later. And then, 1 week later on April 19th, police announced that the charges against Matthew Foerster had been upgraded from second-degree to first-degree murder. Neither police or prosecutors would provide information on why these charges were being upgraded. RCMP Corporal Dan Muskaluk would only tell the media, quote, "I think we'll all be able to see why this has occurred once this is all brought forward in court." There were several criteria that would lead to his charges being upgraded. If the Crown could prove the murder was planned and deliberate, then first-degree murder charges would be appropriate. Other circumstances could include if the murder took place during a forcible confinement situation, or if the murder occurred during a sexual assault. 2 months after he was arrested for accessory after the fact, Matthew's father, Stephen Foerster, was released on $100,000 bail. Meanwhile, Matthew Foerster was still in jail and did not apply for a bail hearing. This was most likely because he knew it would be a waste of time, as he was facing 3 separate trials for violent crimes against women: the murder of Taylor Van Diest, the sexual assault in Kelowna, and the home invasion in Cherryville. However, by October of 2012, Matthew would change his mind. Life behind bars was starting to get to him, so a bail hearing was arranged. It was a long shot, and I commend him for trying, but a Kelowna Supreme Court justice would deny him bail, and Foerster remained behind bars while waiting to go on trial. Exactly 1 year after Taylor was murdered, police announced that extra officers would be patrolling the streets at Armstrong on Halloween night to ease any fears that residents may have. A candlelight walk was also held that evening to mark the first anniversary of Taylor's death. A trail in her honor was being constructed along the railroad tracks where she was discovered, with her family saying, quote, "The area is a place of horror, but it's also a place where we can remember." On the first anniversary of Taylor's murder, the pathway was lined with 270 pumpkins. Because the local pumpkin patch was one of Taylor and her sister Kirsty's favorite places to visit. Over the next year, the community of Armstrong would come together to clean up the area between Pleasant Road and Rosedale Avenue that was full of brush, dead trees, bushes, and uneven gravel. And by 2013, it was transformed into a memorial walking trail in Taylor's honor. With some help from the city and donations from local businesses, the trail was now paved, had fencing, a bench, and a memorial board of Taylor. And the city was working on adding lighting to the trail to make it a safer place to walk. After 2.5 years of waiting and court delays, Matthew Foerster would go on trial March 25, 2014, and the case was expected to last 6 weeks. Crown prosecutors Ian Curry and Frank Caputo would tell the court that while Taylor was walking on Halloween evening to meet up with friends, she texted her boyfriend, saying that she was being crept on. 1 minute later, she attempted to send another text message with the single word Holly, but that text was never sent and was saved to the draft message folder on her phone. Hours later, when Taylor was found by the side of the railroad tracks, she had head injuries and marks on her neck from being strangled. And when she was rushed to the hospital, DNA evidence linking her to the accused was collected. This DNA evidence included fingernail clippings taken from Taylor, as well as blood evidence that was located inside a Ford F-150 They used to be owned by Foerster at the time of the murder. Cell phone records also showed that Matthew Foerster was in the area where Taylor was found around the time she sustained her injuries. The Crown would also tell the jury that one of their key pieces of evidence included a police interrogation video of Foerster, where he admitted that he was sorry for killing Taylor.
She needs to know that your tears are tears of remorse.
She was so much like my mom.
Yeah. You heard her say that what you did was wrong, what you did to your family. And she wants that to be right. That's what it's all about right there, man. It's not about you saying I did this. It's about you proving to these people. It's for me to be able to go to your sister tomorrow and say, your brother is a good person. He does feel bad for what he did, and if he could change back time, he would. You would, wouldn't you?
Yes.
Look me in the eye. Tell me this. Do you feel bad for killing Taylor?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm going to worry. Has it been haunting you since that day? Yeah, I know. You never in a million years thought this would ever be like this, did you? I told you I believed in you. I'm gonna make sure she knows.
On the afternoon of October 31st, 2011, Matthew was traveling from Enderby to Armstrong. After parking his truck, he walked around town, and around 6 p.m., he was walking on the road near the railroad tracks when he noticed Taylor. What happened after this, no one really knows for sure, because Matthew would only give limited details of the assault to the police. But he would admit to pushing Taylor to the ground and telling her to keep quiet. Taylor would not comply with Foerster's demands, and in his words, she just freaked out. Matthew then admitted to police that he caused Taylor's injuries. He told them that he hit her more than once with a sturdy metal flashlight, and that he was involved with what he called a scuffle with her that took them away from the railway tracks to the bushes where she was found. He also admitted to choking her, first with his hands and then with a shoelace.
Sam's really right. Like, you've already told me that you killed her. You already told me that you didn't mean to, that that's not what you went for, that it got out of hand. You told me that you went for sex. And that if she hadn't fought you, you wouldn't have killed her, right? Is that all truthful?
Yes.
Is it, honestly? Yeah? So, like, that's the big part of it now. So, did you come across her, or did you follow her? Came across? So tell me about how that happened. Were you hiding in the bushes, or were you walking on the tracks? I know you haven't even that.
Matthew Foerster must have known that the chances of winning his case were slim to none, because the very next day, in a shocking turn of events, his attorney would submit an agreed statement of defense and told the court that her client was the one who caused the injuries that led to the death of Taylor Van Diest. However, he was not guilty of first-degree murder and said that her client was remorseful and accepted responsibility for causing Taylor's death, but it was the level of intent that mattered. In his videotaped interview with police, he confessed to, quote, wanting to have sex with a girl, but things got out of hand. And if Taylor hadn't fought back, he wouldn't have killed her. I wish I was making that part up. BC Supreme Court Justice Peter Rogers would explain to the jury that this case was no longer a question of whether Foerster killed Taylor, but whether he intended to kill her, which was a necessary piece required for a first-degree murder sentence. The judge also instructed the jury that a killing committed during a sexual assault was considered first-degree murder in the eyes of the law. Dr. Michael Kincannon, the doctor who treated Taylor the night she was brought to the hospital, would tell the jury that nothing short of stopping the attack in the first place would have saved Taylor's life that night. She was unable to breathe on her own and needed a ventilator, which was made more difficult due to the fact that her airway had filled with blood and was misshapen from her injuries. Kincannon also noted issues with Taylor's pupils when he examined her. One was sluggish in responding to light, and the other didn't move much at all. He would tell the court that this was evidence of a severe brain trauma. Another key witness who testified was RCMP Officer Trevor Cook, who specialized in forensic identification. He was responsible for recording the evidence from the area where Taylor was located, as well as a truck that used to be owned by Foerster at the time she was murdered. The black 1999 Ford F-150 had been sold by Foerster to another man, but the RCMP were able to get permission to search the truck in April of 2012. Trevor Cook told the court that he found 9 bloodstains linked to Taylor inside of the truck, and while he was examining the scene of the crime, he found red staining consistent with blood on leaves, trees, and debris, also matching Taylor's DNA. Dr. John Stefanelli, the pathologist who conducted Taylor's autopsy, would also testify. Taylor had suffered 6 separate blows to the head, tearing apart her scalp and fracturing her skull. And in his expert opinion, the skull fracture was caused by a fairly heavy, fairly hard object. He believed that the object used was made of metal, but he could not say for sure what caused the wounds, although he did note that any of the blows could have rendered her unconscious. It was underneath these wounds that the real damage was done. Taylor's brain was bleeding in several areas due to the injury she sustained. There was also evidence that she had been strangled with something long and thin, such as a piece of string or a necklace or a cord, and scratch marks located below these marks were consistent with fingernails, indicating that she fought back against the strangulation. She also had lacerations and bruises on her hands, as well as broken fingers, indicating she was holding up her hands to protect her head at the time of the attack. However, the pathologist could find no evidence a sexual assault had occurred that night. The prosecution would then play the 3-hour video of Matthew Foerster being interviewed by police shortly after he was arrested. Foerster appears emotional in the video, sobbing at various times during the interview, and between the crying and the mumbling, he's very difficult to understand at times. At one point in the interview, Matthew's half-brother would even show up, begging him to get help and peace of mind by doing the right thing. His brother would also hint that he knew about Matthew's urges, and told him that he can't control this anymore, and that he's going to hurt more girls. Matthew would tell Sergeant Mark Davidson that he came across Taylor while walking across town, and talked to her for a few minutes. He then pushed her down and told her to keep quiet, and in his words, she wouldn't listen. He then told Sergeant Davidson that he hit Taylor with a flashlight. Although he couldn't remember how many times he hit her, he knew it was more than once. He then said he choked her with his hands and also used a shoelace, saying that he just meant to keep her quiet. Afterwards, Foerster said he threw away the flashlight and the shoelace into a dumpster near a liquor store in Vernon, as well as a black coat that he was wearing at the time. It was his story that he never intended to kill Taylor and simply just approached her for sex, but in his words, things got out of hand. And even though he killed her, he felt like he was a good person who just messed up, and that spending years in jail was not going to help. I'm getting the ick feeling just reading this. There's no accountability whatsoever. And with that, the Crown would rest their case. Because Matthew admitted to causing Taylor's death, the defense would rest without calling any evidence. In his closing statement, Crown Attorney Ian Curry would argue that Matthew Foerster intended to sexually assault Taylor when he followed her down the path by the railway tracks on Halloween 2011. And when she fought back, Foerster decided to kill her, hitting her over the head multiple times with a flashlight, therefore meeting the requirement for a first-degree murder conviction. The proof of this came directly from Taylor's own hands, and Matthew Foerster's DNA left under her fingernails. In the prosecution's words, Taylor Van Diest caught her own killer, and her last text message being crept, and the unsent text, typed out just 38 seconds later, showed that the attack was sudden. Whatever happened to make Taylor drop her phone was definitely unexpected. The prosecution also pointed out that all evidence from the scene had been carefully and methodically tidied up by Foerster. Everything but that one crucial piece of evidence taken from underneath one of her fingernails, Foerster's DNA. The Crown concluded that Foerster approached Taylor from behind with a shoelace ready to wrap around her throat, causing the ligature marks found around her neck. It was the Crown's theory that this must have happened before the blows to the head from the flashlight, because John Stefanelli testified that she had scratch marks on her neck, that he concluded were from Taylor trying to claw at whatever was choking her. Prosecutor Ian Curry also would question why Foerster had a flashlight in the first place. The attack happened just after 6 p.m., and officers who tested the environment and lighting conditions a few days later noted that it was not dark enough by that time to require a light. And why else would he be walking in a secluded area, wearing a dark coat, carrying a flashlight, and armed with a shoelace, unless it was for a nefarious purpose? The Crown would also point out that an assault to facilitate a sexual assault is still a sexual assault. In her closing argument, Foerster's attorney, Lisa Helps, suggested her client's answers to police were taken out of context. I'm not sure what answers she's referring to. He really didn't say that much between the sobbing and the mumbling. She attempted to convince the jury that her client was not a predator, and pointed out that the attack happened quickly, and Foerster could have possibly been drunk at the time of the attack and panicked, which would explain why he told police his mind was a blur on more than one occasion. The defense told the jury that the sixth blow to the head killed Taylor, because apparently the first 5 hits to the head didn't matter. The fatal blow could have been caused by Taylor slipping on the tracks and falling onto a metal pipe found in the bushes underneath where she laid. And if this was the case, then Matthew was only guilty of manslaughter and not murder. According to the defense, when Matthew threw away his coat, flashlight, and shoelace, this only proved that Foerster panicked because he was immature and not a particularly bright individual. His lawyer argued there was no evidence that a sexual assault ever took place, and would tell the jury that a busy night like Halloween and a popular shortcut like a rail line is not the best time or place to commit that type of crime. Taylor's mother, Mary Van Diest, called the defense's theory laughable, saying that it sounded a little too far-fetched and unrealistic for anyone to believe. And fortunately, the jury of 5 women and 7 men would agree. They would deliberate for 24 hours before finding Matthew Foerster guilty of first-degree murder.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. I'm Chris Brown. We begin tonight in Kelowna, where a jury has found 28-year-old Matthew Foerster guilty of first-degree murder in the death of an Armstrong teenager. 18-year-old Taylor Van Diest was killed on Halloween night in 2011. Tim Weeks has our top story.
After 2 weeks of sometimes horrifying testimony, the family of Taylor Van Diest finally showed smiles and relief.
At least we got the best outcome we could have gotten under the circumstances.
We'll never bring her back, but at least now no other girl will meet the same fate that she met, and yeah, we're just happy that that animal is going to be off the streets for a very long time. Not long enough for me, but it'll suffice for now.
He showed no emotion when the verdict was read, and when Matthew was asked by Justice Peter Rogers if he had anything to say, his defense attorney would decline on his behalf. Foerster was handed an automatic life sentence in prison, with no eligibility for parole until at least 25 years. Foerster's lack of emotion in the courtroom didn't surprise Taylor's family. They would tell reporters outside of the courthouse that the fact he chose not to speak spoke volumes in how cowardly, dysfunctional, and deviant he was. Mary also spoke about the need for victims' rights, and not just the accused. About a month after Matthew Foerster was convicted of first-degree murder, it was announced that his father, Stephen Foerster, was expected to plead guilty to accessory after the fact in connection to Taylor's murder. He was also charged with obstruction of justice, but this charge would later be stayed. During his sentencing, the court learned that he went to great lengths to help Matthew hide from the police. He lied about the location of his son for 5 months while the RCMP was conducting their investigation, and told them that his son was working in the oil patch in Alberta. While the RCMP attempted to locate Matthew, his father purchased him a new identity and counseled him on how to avoid detection from authorities. He was also in the process of buying a second fake ID for Matthew around the time the two men were arrested in April of 2012. Matthew had been renting an apartment in Lumbee at the time of Taylor's murder. Shortly afterwards, he told his landlord that he would be moving out in December. However, according to court records, in November of 2011, 2 women would pack up Matthew's apartment, and Stephen collected the boxes a short time later. In December of 2011, Stephen Foerster bought ID from a family friend. He paid $500 for a driver's license, bank card, and social insurance number. Before he left town, Matthew drove to Kamloops on December 4th and bought 2 prepaid cell phones with additional airtime. He also asked for Alberta area codes, which the Crown said correlated with Stephen's claims that Matthew was working in northern Alberta. At some point, the RCMP was able to intercept calls between father and son, and that's how they discovered that Matthew had been living in Collingwood, Ontario this entire time. 2 days after the last conversation between father and son, both men would be arrested. In the end, a 3-year sentence would be agreed upon between Crown attorneys and defense counsel for Stephen Foerster. With time that Stephen already served in pretrial custody following his arrest, it meant that he would spend just over 2 years in prison. Justice Peter Rogers chose to go along with the 3-year sentence, but also said on the record that if left to his own devices, he would have handed Stephen a much harsher penalty. Justice Rogers said in his view that Stephen knew that Matthew was a killer and that he killed a defenseless girl and killed her at random. And this showed a profound lack of judgment on the part of Stephen Foerster, as he helped his son evade detection and apprehension. When given the opportunity, Stephen apologized to the Van Diest family, saying they had already suffered more than any family should. Speaking to the media for what should have been the last time, Mary Van Diest showed no sympathy for Stephen Foerster, saying that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. 1 month after Stephen was convicted of accessory after the fact, it was announced that Matthew had filed a notice of appeal to have his first-degree murder conviction overturned. The notice stated that the judge had erred on his instructions to the jury when explaining intent, intoxication, and on the offense of attempted sexual assault as an element of first-degree murder. And later that same month, it was announced that Foerster would be pleading guilty to the 2 previous violent attacks on women that occurred back in 2004 and 2005. He would be sentenced to 6 years on each count, to be served concurrently with his life sentence. He was also required to give a DNA sample, have no contact with either victim, and would also have a lifetime firearms ban, and would be placed on the sexual offender registry for life. In 2017, the BC Court of Appeal would unanimously agree to 2 of the 5 issues raised by Matthew Foerster's lawyers. His first-degree murder conviction was overturned, and a new trial was ordered. In his reason for the judgment, Justice Harvey Groberman found that there were 2 important errors that may have misled the jury, and that the original jury should have been told that Foerster's disposal of a shoelace and flashlight had no bearing on whether he was guilty of murder or manslaughter. The Court of Appeal would also say that the jury was incorrectly instructed on how it could interpret Van Diest's last text message before her death. To say that Taylor's family was angry with this decision was an understatement. In an interview with CBC News, Taylor's mother would say that she had received a call from a Crown lawyer informing her of the court's decision, and she thought it was pathetic that a judge's instructions could be picked apart like that. This decision also confirmed to the family that the accused or the convicted in Canada have all the rights. However, although Matthew Foerster's first-degree murder conviction was overturned, there wouldn't be another trial. 1 year later, in March of 2018, a plea bargain was reached between the prosecution and defense. Matthew Foerster pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, and although the family would not have to sit through another trial, they were not happy about the plea bargain either. Mary Van Diest would say that Taylor's killer won when he pled guilty to the lesser charge, and that to the family, he will always be guilty of first-degree murder. Second-degree murder, like first-degree murder, is an automatic life sentence. He essentially was admitting that he knew his actions would cause Taylor's death, but he hadn't planned it in advance. As far as sentencing was concerned, the only difference between first-degree and second-degree murder is when Matthew was able to apply for parole. At his new sentencing hearing, the Crown and the defense would agree that Matthew would have to serve 17 years before he was allowed to apply for parole. This new hearing was like adding salt to a wound for the Van Diest family. There were also new elements to the case added by Foerster's defense lawyers that they had never heard before. The defense claimed that Matthew started drinking around noon that day and was mixing beer, hard alcohol, and drugs before approaching Taylor. After driving from Lumbee to Armstrong, he would pull his vehicle over because he realized he was probably too intoxicated to drive and should try to walk off some of the booze. He did confirm what everybody already suspected, that Matthew and Taylor had never met prior to the night he attacked her on the railway tracks. The sentence meant that Foerster would not be eligible to apply for parole until April 4th, 2029, when he is 43 years old. This doesn't mean he'll be approved, it only means he can apply. But given his sketchy history of attacks against women, I doubt he'll be released at that time. However, it does mean that any time he wants to apply for parole, the Van Diest family will be re-traumatized by the process. Unlike his first trial, Foerster decided to read a letter of remorse that he wrote for the Van Diest family. He stood up and faced towards them and slowly read the letter. Part of this letter read, quote, "I'm so sorry for the pain I have caused you. I wish I could take back what happened." For the Van Diest family, his apology meant nothing. In their eyes, he's still guilty of first-degree murder, and that he won an appeal through a technicality is ridiculous. Quote, "In his letter of apology, not once did he mention Taylor's name. And in my eyes, I see that as him still not accepting responsibility. Thank you so much for watching and taking the time to hang out with me today. If you enjoyed learning about this case, please be sure to like and subscribe. If there's a case you would like me to cover in a future video, let me know in the comments section down below. To support my channel, you can go to Buy Me a Coffee if you would like to donate. Thanks again, and I will see you next time.